April 19th, 2011, a half-built Saab 9.5 sits frozen on the assembly line in Trollhättan, Sweden. The welding torches are cold, the workers have gone home, and 62 years of automotive rebellion just stopped. If you've never driven a Saab, this probably means nothing to you. But if you have, if you've ever twisted that key between the seats, felt turbo lag before the surge, or sat in that wraparound cockpit, you understand what died that day. This isn't about bankruptcy, it's about what happens when bean counters kill dreamers, when corporate sameness devours innovation. This is why enthusiasts love Saab more than logic would allow, and why it failed anyway. The golden years. Saab didn't start as a car company, they built fighter jets. Svenska Airplan Aktiebolaget, Swedish Airplane Company Limited. During World War II, they were cranking out military aircraft for a neutral Sweden that still needed to defend its airspace. Then 1945 hit, the war ended, and suddenly they had factories full of aircraft engineers with nothing to build. So they did what any logical airplane company would do, they built cars. But here's the thing, they built them like aircraft engineers. The first Saab, the 92 in 1949, looked like someone melted a bar of soap because they literally tested the shape in a wind tunnel. Aerodynamics weren't a marketing gimmick, they were doctrine. It was front-wheel drive when rear-wheel was standard. It was built to survive Swedish winters and roads that could double as geological surveys. And weirdly, it worked. But Saab didn't become Saab until 1977. The Saab 99 Turbo rewrote what a practical car could be. This was one of the first mainstream turbocharged vehicles, and it proved you didn't need a V8 to make power. You needed a brain. A small four-cylinder could punch like a heavyweight if you engineered it with precision, and Saab did. Then came the icon. The Saab 900, produced from 1978 to 1993, is the car that turned Saab from a quirky Swedish brand into a cult, specifically the 900 Turbo. That was the one. It had a wraparound windshield that made you feel like you were sitting in a fighter cockpit, not by accident. The ignition wasn't on the steering column like every other car. It was between the front seats, in a place that made sense if you thought about safety and theft prevention. If you didn't know that, you weren't in the club. The headlights wiped themselves. The cup holder slid out of the dash like a secret drawer. Quirks weren't bugs, they were signatures. The dashboard wrapped around the driver. Everything was positioned where it should be, even when that wasn't where you expected it. These were solutions from people who thought about how humans actually use cars, not how focus groups said they should. And the seats. God, the seats. Developed with orthopedic surgeons for long-distance comfort, you could drive a 900 for 8 hours and get out feeling better than when you got in. The Turbo itself wasn't the fastest in its class, but the power delivery was addictive. You'd press the throttle, wait, then whoosh, the boost hit. You learned to drive around the lag, and when you got the timing right, the car rewarded you like a puzzle solved correctly. None of this was normal, all of it was Saab. The 900 Turbo was quick, safe, practical, deeply weird, and it made you feel smarter for driving it. It wasn't competing with BMW or Mercedes. It was trying to be a Saab, and if you understood that, you really understood. Saab owners were different. Engineers, architects, doctors, college professors, people who appreciated that someone had actually thought about how a car should work instead of copying homework from Detroit. They'd wave at each other on the highway, help each other source parts, defend their choice to anyone who asked, why not just get a Volvo? Because it's not a Volvo, it's a Saab. And if you know, you know. In 1984, Saab launched the 9000, an executive sedan developed alongside Fiat, Lancia, and Alfa Romeo as part of the Type 4 platform project. The 9000 Aero with its turbocharged 2.3-liter inline-4 was genuinely fast, refined, and comfortable. It proved Saab could take a shared platform and still make it unmistakably theirs. By the late 1980s, Saab was peaking. The cars were innovative, the brand had cachet, the future looked bright. And then General Motors came knocking, the GM era. In 1989, General Motors bought 50% of Saab. By 2000, they owned it completely. And at first, this looked like it might actually work. GM had money, global scale, resources Saab could only dream about. Saab had engineering talent and a customer base so devoted they bordered on religious. GM promised Saab would keep its independence, its Swedish identity, its soul. They probably even meant it. But good intentions don't survive quarterly earnings calls. The first casualty was the 900. When the classic ended production in 1993, it was replaced by a new 900 built on the Opel Vectra platform. Same bones as a mainstream GM sedan, just with Saab badges and some styling massaged over the top. To GM, this was efficiency, smart business, platform sharing. To Saab enthusiasts, it was betrayal. The ignition was still between the seats, because even GM knew removing it would cause a riot. But everything else felt different. The dashboard that used to wrap around you like a second skin, now it could have come from any GM parts bin. The steering lost its feedback. The new electric rack was lighter, more modern, and utterly numb. The interior materials that used to last decades started showing their generic origins after a few years. On Saab forums, the verdict was unanimous. It doesn't feel like a Saab anymore. But GM wasn't done. Oh no, they were just getting started, and enter the 92X and 97X. The final insults. The 92X, launched in 2005, was a Subaru Impreza wagon with a Saab grille grafted on like a bad facelift. Subaru built it, Saab badged it. Enthusiasts nicknamed it the Saabaroo, which tells you everything you need to know. Car reviewers actually liked it. It was a good car, but it had zero Saab DNA, no design language, no engineering philosophy, no Swedish identity, just a competent Japanese wagon having an identity crisis. The 97X was somehow worse. This was a Chevrolet Trailblazer, a body-on-frame, truck-based SUV with Saab badges slapped on. A Swedish aircraft company's legacy reduced to rebadging Chevy trucks. It had a Saab grille, some interior tweaks, and underneath, pure GM truck platform. It drove and felt like a Trailblazer, but it fooled exactly nobody. These weren't Saabs, they were GM products with Saab stickers shipped to Saab dealers to pad the lineup and juice sales numbers. The message to loyal customers was clear: your brand doesn't matter anymore. Meanwhile, the 9.3 and 9.5 sold reasonably well. The 900 became the 9.3 in 1998. The 9000 was replaced by the 9.5. Both were turbocharged sedans that moved units. Both were safe, reliable, practical, and both felt like they'd been designed by committee instead of by Swedish aircraft engineers who gave a damn. If you squinted, they still had Saab DNA, but they were compromised. Platform sharing with Opel and Chevrolet meant sacrificing the weird quirks that made Saab Saab. The wraparound windshield shrank, the materials got cheaper, the steering got vaguer. Little by little, Saab was being watered down to fit GM's global strategy, and the fans noticed. Sales started slipping. The people who loved Saabs for being different watched them become generic, and the people who wanted a mainstream luxury sedan had zero reason to choose Saab over BMW, Audi, or Mercedes. Saab was stuck in no man's land, not weird enough for the cult, not prestigious enough for the masses. Here's the thing about GM's perspective. It wasn't evil, it was just business. Saab peaked at around 133,000 cars a year in the late 80s, most in niche markets. That's nothing in GM's world. Cadillac, Buick, Chevrolet, those were the priorities. Saab was expensive to run, difficult to integrate, and never consistently profitable. By the mid-2000s, Saab was essentially orphaned within GM, budget slashed, product development delayed, platform sharing intensified, the loyal customers were leaving, the Swedish identity was fading, and the cars, while still decent, had lost the plot entirely. Then 2008 happened. The collapse. The 2008 financial crisis didn't just hit the economy, it executed entire car brands. GM nearly collapsed under the weight of its own bloat, and as part of their bankruptcy restructuring, they made a decision. Saab had to go. Too small, too unprofitable, too complicated. In 2009, GM announced they were shutting Saab down completely. The Swedish government scrambled to help. Saab employees protested in the streets. The loyal customer base rallied online, in forums, in letters to executives. And for a brief, shining moment, there was hope. Koenigsegg wanted to buy Saab. Yes, that Koenigsegg, the Swedish hypercar manufacturer that built million-dollar track weapons. They wanted to take Saab back to its roots, back to Swedish independence and innovation. Enthusiasts lost their minds. Imagine it, Koenigsegg's engineering philosophy applied to Saab's practical ethos. A return to form, the dream scenario. The deal fell apart. Koenigsegg couldn't secure financing. GM pulled out, and Saab was left in limbo bleeding cash with no buyer and no future. Then Spyker showed up. Spyker was a small Dutch sports car manufacturer with big ambitions and not nearly enough money. In early 2010, they bought Saab from GM for $400 million and promised to revive the brand. Against all logic, it almost worked. The second generation 9.5 launched in 2010, and it was good. This was the Saab the brand had needed a decade earlier. Sophisticated styling, powerful turbocharged engines, Scandinavian interior design that felt premium without being pretentious. It competed with the Germans. It looked like a Saab and even drove like a Saab. And for the first time in years, it felt like Saab had figured out how to be modern without selling its soul. But it was too late. Spyker was underfunded from day one. Saab was burning cash trying to ramp up production. Suppliers started demanding payment up front because they didn't trust Saab to stay solvent. Parts shipments stopped, assembly lines slowed, and in April 2011, the money ran out. Production stopped. Not with drama, not with speeches or ceremonies. The assembly line just stopped. Workers clocked out, not knowing if they'd ever clock back in. Half-finished cars sat frozen on the production floor like industrial fossils. The welding torches went cold. The factory in Trollhättan, the heart of Saab for over 60 years, went silent. For the people of Trollhättan, this wasn't just about jobs. Saab was the town. Generations had worked in that factory. Your grandfather built the 99. Your father built the 900. You were building the 95. When production stopped, workers gathered outside the gates. Some held signs, some just stood there, staring at the building where they'd spent their entire careers. The parts suppliers were left holding warehouses full of components built on spec. Some went bankrupt, others barely survived. Inside the factory, unfinished cars sat like ghosts. The next generation 9-3, the car that was supposed to save everything, existed only as prototypes locked in a design studio. Spyker tried to find buyers. Chinese companies expressed interest. The Swedish government tried to intervene again, but it was over. In December 2011, Saab Automobile AB declared bankruptcy. Only about 11,000 second-generation 9.5s were ever built. The 9.4X crossover barely entered production before being canceled. Future products, new platforms, updated engines, a redesigned 9.3 were shelved forever. Trollhättan closed its doors. Around 3,700 people lost their jobs. The brand that had been building cars since 1949 was gone. There were revival attempts. National Electric Vehicle Sweden, a Chinese-backed company, bought the assets and tried to build electric 9.3s. They produced a handful before running out of money in 2014. Another Chinese consortium tried in 2016. That failed too. Saab was dead, and it wasn't coming back. The legacy. Saab represented something that's nearly extinct in the modern car industry, a brand that thought differently. They weren't chasing luxury status like Mercedes. They weren't obsessed with lap times like BMW. Saab built cars for thinkers, people who cared about safety, practicality, and clever design more than impressing the neighbors. Their vehicles were engineered by people who asked why instead of why not, and every answer had to make sense. The cockpit-style dashboard wasn't for aesthetics, it was for driver focus and safety. The ignition between the seats wasn't a quirk, it was theft prevention and ergonomic logic borrowed from aviation. The wraparound windshield improved visibility and structural integrity. Everything had a reason, everything had purpose. That came from Saab's roots in aircraft manufacturing. Before they built cars, they built planes that had to keep pilots alive. That mindset never left. Driving a Saab felt like piloting something engineered for control, precision, and survival, not just speed or style. And they innovated constantly, turbocharging for everyday cars, heated seats designed for Scandinavian winters, impact-resistant safety cages, headlamp washers for snowy roads, active head restraints to prevent whiplash. These weren't marketing gimmicks, they were problems identified and solved by engineers who gave a damn. But Saab wasn't just about the machines, it was about the people who drove them. Saab owners weren't typical car buyers, they were believers. They understood that a Saab was strange in the best possible way. They'd debate turbo lag and front-wheel drive handling dynamics, like philosophy majors arguing Kant. They'd defend the center ignition placement like it was scripture. And when other drivers traded cars every few years, Saab owners kept theirs running for decades. It wasn't unusual to see a 900 or 9.3 pass 300,000 miles. That loyalty became a culture, a community that still exists today. Saab clubs thrive around the world, from Sweden to the US to Australia. Owners trade parts, share repair guides, and keep the brand alive out of pure passion. When you see a Saab on the road today, it's not there by accident. Someone loves that car enough to keep it alive, sourcing obscure parts online, rebuilding engines in their garage, refusing to let it die. So could Saab have survived? Maybe. When General Motors took over in 1990, there was genuine hope. GM had resources, global reach, manufacturing scale. Saab had engineering brilliance and a devoted fan base. On paper, it could have worked, but GM didn't understand what made Saab special. They saw a quirky Swedish brand that needed to be fixed, streamlined, rationalized, made palatable to the masses. They wanted Saab to fit into a corporate mold, to share platforms and parts with Opel and Chevrolet, to become another cog in the machine. So they forced badge-engineered models like the 92X, a Subaru in disguise, and the 97X, a rebadged Chevy truck. Both were fine vehicles, neither was a Saab. By the time the genuinely good second-gen 9.5 arrived in 2010, the damage was done. The world had moved on, Saab's uniqueness had been buried under corporate sameness. The cult was disillusioned. The mainstream had better options. If GM had let Saab be Saab, let it stay weird, stay niche, stay proudly, unapologetically different, the story might have ended differently. But once you strip away what makes a brand unique, it's only a matter of time before it fades into irrelevance. That's the lesson Saab left behind. Badge engineering kills identity. Platform sharing done carelessly destroys heritage. A brand's soul isn't in its profit margins, it's in its purpose. Saab made cars that put people first. Cars that didn't follow trends or chase status. Cars that made you feel something when you drove them. Saab made mistakes, sure. They were too small to compete with giants. Too quirky to please the masses. Too stubborn to compromise their vision. But they stood for something rare in today's world. The belief that you could engineer a car for humans, not markets. Their designs might have been odd, but they were honest. Their engineering was practical, but inspired. Saab wasn't just a car company, it was an idea that technology could serve people with intelligence and integrity, not ego. Even though Saab is gone, its spirit lingers. You can see echoes of its philosophy in modern Volvos, the driver-focused layouts, the obsession with safety. But nothing feels quite like a real Saab. That turbo punch, that solid cocoon-like cockpit, that sense you're driving something built by people who truly cared. Ask anyone who owned one. They'll tell you about the quirks, the repairs, the parts hunting adventures. They'll tell you about winter drives where the heated seats and sure-footed handling made brutal weather feel manageable. They'll tell you about that feeling of safety, not just physical, but existential. The sense that someone, somewhere had thought about you when they designed this thing. And they'll tell you, often with a proud smile, that a Saab wasn't just a car they drove, it was a car that fit them. Saab didn't die because people stopped loving it. It died because the system it lived in couldn't handle something so individual, so uncompromising, so different. And that's the real tragedy, not just of a car brand, but of what happens to creativity in a world ruled by conformity.